Well, I hope so.
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Mr. Speaker, this is quite a technical bill, and those people now who don't understand that were asleep before the Minister started, if not by the time he'd finished. Mr. Speaker, I won't go into the technical details of the bill. I know that the Chairman of the Select Committee will probably do that. Other than to say that Labor supports the bill, and it's basically about bringing or updating the protections for people who do some research to investigate whether a product is safe to use in the New Zealand agricultural system. So the committee worked across the board, all parties, trying to get the most sensible outcome here. And the balance was one of ensuring that the people who did the work, the research, who spent the money, got some ability to recoup that investment by being able to sell their products for a specific purpose for a reasonable period of time, be that from 5 to 8 years or to 10 years. And we've heard the Minister explain the adjustments that the Committee on Balance thought were necessary to ensure that, you know, the people who spent the money got some ability to return it. Now, why is this important? Well, Kiwis are great innovators, and the terms that the Minister used, innovative products, non-innovative products and all the rest of it that put most of us to sleep, effectively are about trying to protect Kiwis from ourselves. Because when we see a chemical or we get provided with that chemical for a crop that kills certain weeds or kills certain pests, then the classic Kiwi farmer or grower will say, well, that could be quite good to use on this other crop or pest. And that probably occurred in the past, more often than it should have. But in the new world of maximum residue levels, of off-label use, and that's the kind of innovation, the reality is that all of our food products, all the produce that comes from our country is scrutinised by the importing countries around the world to ensure that we haven't, by mistake or by design, incorporated the use of a product that they may consider a contaminant. And the ability now for people to test right down to, you know, parts per million, if not parts per billion, and identify an unwanted chemical, mean that we have to ensure our systems are right up to speed and don't allow the use of chemicals in an inappropriate way. But we want to continue to innovate. And so just as we are breeding new plant species, we're improving the productivity rates across the board, and we're looking to chemical companies to assist us to protect or to control disease, we want to make sure we're doing it in the right way. So you come back to the major change in this bill is actually allowing the use or encouraging the innovative use of products, but only when the research has been carried out to ensure that if they are applied, there's no danger to consumers or to the land or to the people applying the chemicals. So there'll be research that arrives at recommendations, and if you pick up a can of chemicals and you've got very good eyesight or you've got a magnifying glass, you can read the instructions because they are quite detailed, and they have to be. And it is important that people get trained to use chemicals properly to ensure that you don't put twice the rate that you should and mean that there's chemical left behind in the food that you produce, or that you apply it at the right time. And all of these things are absolutely crucial if we're to run the finest, safest food production systems in the world. So what we have done in this bill is made some adjustments to say to the companies, they might be New Zealand companies or they might be offshore companies that are selling into New Zealand, that if you see the potential for the use of an active ingredient in one chemical and you think it may be useful on another crop, then you can do that but you have to abide by the process to get registration. But if you do that, we'll ensure that you get 5 years or 8 years or 10 years protection of the intellectual property that you have developed. Because the alternative is that someone just comes along, gets access to that information, writes a different recommendation on their spray or changes a compound and then sells it for a price just under that of I guess the company that's done all the work and makes perhaps an unfair profit. We need to encourage innovation across the agrochemical sector, and we need them to be able to make a fair return. There's always an interesting debate about what is fair and I guess what is excessive. The farmers, on the other hand, and the growers want to buy the product for as cheap as they can. So they want competition in the market. They want 2 or 3 or 4 people producing the same kinds of chemicals so that there's a competition to keep the prices down. But there does have to be discipline, and that's where government and that's where the agencies, AgCom and the others come in to ensure in having healthy competition we don't cut corners and we don't put at risk any part of our food production system that might end up with a product offshore being tested, a residue being discovered, and that consignment being rejected or sent back to New Zealand with the reputational damage that that would cause us. And I think every member of the Select Committee had that at the back of their mind, that we're trying to protect our food production systems. As I say, I'm sure that the chairman of the committee will explain in detail the reasons for the change in the timeline protections. They were quite complex, I have to say, but he's, as the chairman of the committee, in the position to do that, plainly. I'll stick to the general principles and say that Labor does support the bill. We've worked with committee members to come up with what we think is a fair, reasonable and reasonable solution that protects those who are doing the innovation and those who are carrying out the research, but doesn't protect their rights so long as to remove competition and downward pressure on those chemicals. The reality is the production of the chemicals themselves usually costs very, very little. But the research required to get them approved as safe and to get them approved to be used in a safe way that must be upheld, that's where all the money has to be spent. And I guess it's an ongoing dilemma in the pharmaceutical sector, but also in the agri-chemical area. Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to speak for too much longer other than to say that I think we have a reasonably robust system. I think we do need to keep ahead of international guidelines around MRLs. We do have traditional practices in agriculture that need to be updated and upgraded, and we need to look carefully at a number of things that we're still using that might end up being unwanted over time. And the ongoing use of conventional fertilisers and other chemicals, such as glyphosate, are coming under scrutiny around the world. In Europe, they're looking to ban that. And I have to say that we've got to stay ahead of that and look for alternative, safer chemicals or chemicals that they consider are safe, so that we can continue to sell our high-value produce into high-value markets around the world. So Labor, Mr. Speaker, supports the process that we've gone through as a Select Committee, supports the outcome of this, but does leave a word of warning saying that this is a very active area of monitoring and management, and the passage of this legislation will be good for a short time, and we'll then need to stay ahead of monitoring of maximum residue levels and other chemicals that we're using across New Zealand to ensure that our reputation is not ever undermined by the sale of produce that people perceive may be unsafe for consumption. Mr. Speaker, Labor supports this legislation.